So our Global Women's Leadership Initiative, for those of you who don't know, is focused on ensuring that by 2050, women hold 50% of leadership positions across the globe. Yay, thank you. So we want to ensure that women are sitting at every decision-making table across the globe. But we don't want women to be at the table alone. I'm smiling at you, Wade. We don't want women to be at the table alone, and we don't necessarily want them to change the world alone. We want women and men together. We want them to change the institutions, the systems. We want them from across culture, class, religion, and group to work together to ensure that there is equal opportunity for all and that women and men equally can lead their communities and their nations. So in this vein, today, we are here to talk about the role that men play in this revolution. We're here to launch the book, The Time Has Come, Why Men Must Join the Gender Equality Revolution, written by Dr. Michael Kaufman, and I have learned just now that this is the launch of the Grand Book Tour across the United States. And today, Dr. Kaufman will discuss the men's role in promoting gender equality and women's rights and reshaping the lives of men and women. And we will follow this with a discussion between Dr. Kaufman and Gary Barker, who is the president and CEO of ProMundo. And we'll discuss the relationship between gender and power and how relationships in both the public and private space can translate into gender equality. You have the bio of Dr. Kaufman in your hand, and the handouts are on the front desk. And with further ado, Michael, I welcome you to the stage. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, all of you, for being here today. Well, it is a book launch, so let me just start by reading. The public world of gender relations is exploding around us. The private world of relationships, families, and sex is a minefield of power and love. There has never, ever, in the 8,000-year history of our male-dominated world, been a moment quite like this. You and I are living it, the gender equality revolution. It's in our offices and factories in the quest for equal pay, for women's advancement and against sexual harassment. It's on college campuses, in downtown neighborhoods, and suburban homes in the fight to end violence against women. It's the struggle by parents to redefine whose work it is to raise children, and for society to provide the resources for parents to do the job well. It's the back and forth skirmishes to ensure that women have the unalienable right to physical autonomy, including choosing whether or not to become a parent. It's a powerful rethinking of how we raise girls and boys. It's a celebration of the right to love who we want to love and define who we want to be. It's a push for more and more diverse women in politics and in the boardroom. The gender equality revolution is coming on fast and coming on strong. It's time for men to join the fight for gender equality. Well, I won't go on to read the rest of the book, but this is absolutely an amazing time. I think for many of us who've been working for years to promote gender justice, women's rights, to redefine what it means to be a man, to work to end violence against women, to push for reproductive rights for women, to push for LGBTQ rights, to understand the intersection of these different struggles, to understand how our gender identities as women and men get racialized. Those of us who've been working on all these things for years have to just step back and be amazed at the moment we are living in. I think for years, many of us talked about, yeah, we've got to figure out how to go mainstream, how to bring these ideas to a larger audience so we're not just debating them in gender studies courses or in a few NGOs or government offices. Well, folks, it's happening. We're seeing it right now. It's hard to go by a day without some headline in the newspaper, some new ad on TV, some scandal perhaps. Some, and I say headlines, some of those are positive, some are negative, but it's happening right now. And so I think one of the things that we need to do as a start when we talk about the gender equality revolution is we have to celebrate. It's so easy in the work that you and I do, in our preoccupations in the world and occupations, to focus on problems. We spend a lot of energy focusing on the problem. We're going to work on this one and that one. We're going to push for this new law, this new policy. But we also have to celebrate the accomplishments so far. Because if we don't celebrate those things, anyone can come along and they say, well, what's been the point of 40 years, 50 years of women's activism? Why bother if it hasn't led to change? And so we should celebrate the change that's happened, while at the same time raising concerns about the long ways that we still have to go. That change, of course, has been pioneered by heroic and courageous women right around the world. The fact that I'm standing here, the fact that Gary and Promundo are doing their work to engage men is not just because, it's somehow just, occurred to us, wow, sexism, it's a problem, patriarchy, a problem. Of course, it's been the fight by women, led by women, championed by women, at times with, enormous cost to those women champions that have brought men into this conversation. And men are in this conversation. We're seeing it right here in this room. It's typical in any discussion still of gender issues. There's still an assumption, this must be women's issues, and there's more women in the room. But I can tell you, just looking out at you, the numbers of men here, I wouldn't have seen in a room 10 years ago, let alone 20 or 30 years ago. This is a big, big change. This is a big change. We reserve the spot at the front for you. No, thank you for so many of you for coming tonight. So this is an incredible moment. It's a difficult moment too. I think we have to recognize that. You don't overthrow 8,000 or 10,000 years of social history, of social relationships, of structures, of ideas. You don't do that without feeling a bit uncomfortable. Because the thing about gender is, yes, it's a social construct. It's ideas of what it means to be men and women. And it's been ideas formed within a gender binary that have not only said, yes, you're this or you're this, but have set this line right down the center. And woe be it to him or her or they who crosses that line. And so, of course, it's going to be upsetting. But it's not just that gender is out there as a social construct. It's not just that gender is out there in ways that we institutionalize it. But one of the incredible things, and one of the things I talk about in the book, are the ways that we internalize gender expectations. The old debate on nature versus nurture. And it's actually a debate that now we're surpassing. And it's an old debate. It's an old debate because now scientists know more about the brain. And one of the incredible things about our brains is that plasticity that all of us, I am a world-famous neuroscientist, so it is the type of language I use all the time. But for those of you who are not world-famous neuroscientists like myself, anyway, we hear the talk about brain plasticity. But of course, what that means is our brains just keep changing. But it also means that our brains absorb social realities and change in the context of society. So that nature versus nurture thing, gender, patriarchy, our ideals of manhood and womanhood are very much about gender and expectations and social relationships and relations of power. But the incredible thing is we internalize those things right into our developing brain. We become gendered. Our brains become gendered. Our bodies become gendered. The way I walk and talk and smoke a cigarette all becomes part of that embodiment of gender. And that's why change is so difficult. Because it's not just an idea we're changing. It's not just a new policy, but it's who we are. It's about our place in the world. It's about how we stand and sit and walk and interact, how we look at each other, how we talk to each other. And so it means that change is profoundly difficult. But it's made even more difficult because, of course, you could say on one level there are winners and losers. If we're going to be talking about the empowerment of women, if we're going to be talking about equal representation, as we are, of women at all levels of our economy, at all levels of our governments, well, think about it. There are those out there who go, hey, you're talking about affirmative action. Here's what I say to them. I say, men have had an 8,000-year-long affirmative action program, and we call it patriarchy. And so, guys, yeah, it's difficult. We suddenly have to compete with the other half of humanity. So you could say, yeah, there's a loss in there for men because you have to suddenly compete with half of humanity for that job, that position, that accomplishment, whatever it might be. And so there is that sense of winning and losing. But the thing that is the running theme of this book, The Time Has Come, is focused on the paradox of men's power. It's the work that I've been doing going back several decades now. looking at this contradictory experiences of men in male-dominated societies. And what does that mean? Well, we live in societies where men have more power, have forms of privilege. And so you might think, we could go through it. You and I, and in this audience, we could, just list off, everyone here could list off, yes, men make more money and men occupy positions of social power, and we run the world's religions and we run the world's media. We'd go on and on. And so you would think if we just, walked out onto the streets of Washington, D.C. with, doing those man-on-the-street interviews and, going up to men with all of men's power and said, "Excuse me, sir, tell me about all of your power." Stick the microphone in a man's face, and he would look at you like you're crazy. He'd go, "Power? Me? Are you kidding? I don't have power." Now, what would be the reason for this disconnect between the very real world of men's power and this man's experience of, well, I don't have power? Well, part of it is the invisibility of power and privilege. The thing about privilege, whether we have forms of privilege based on our skin color, our sexual orientation, our sex, is it becomes invisible. It just becomes, it's just the way things are. And so the thing that's most, in a way, nefarious about privilege is how invisible it is. So that man saying, "I don't have power, I don't have privilege," is that the ways that he has enjoyed power and privilege, the things that the anti-racist educator, Peggy McIntosh, referred to, this invisible knapsack that white people walk around with, of the tools and the keys to get into the door, that's invisible to my brothers. How does it become visible? Well, it becomes visible through the voices of women, the women's movement, the impact of feminism on men, as women raise their voices and say to men, "It's time you listen." Some of the incredible power of the Me Too movement is precisely that. It's this, not coordinated, but it's this concert of voices saying to men, "Listen, you gotta listen." So that's part of the reason why he doesn't understand his privilege and power. It's invisible to him. Part of the reason, though, is that patriarchy is not only a society of men's power over women, but it's also a hierarchy of power of some men over other men. And so there are men who have less power than other men because of their socioeconomic class or the color of their skin or their nationality or whether English in this context is a first or second language, and on and on. And so there's very real forms of powerlessness that many men do experience. That's real. That's real. But the other thing, and perhaps the most amazing thing, is this. Here we are in a society which we've given men more privilege. From the moment of birth, we raise boys to be real men, to be tough and strong and in control, not show too many emotions, not show too many feelings. Not supposed to even have you ever had a feeling? I hope not. No, good. Just checking out. You ever had one of those? Good, okay. Right on, men. These ideas and expectations. And the truth is none of us can live up to them. None of us can be, always, quote, strong, powerful, in control, have all the answers, not show any feelings, not be vulnerable, make a ton of, just the list is this endless list of what a colleague of ours years ago called the man box. And it's now picked up in a wonderful report and series of resources by Promundo. And so within that, if we can't live up to those expectations, those gendered expectations of manhood, what happens to men within that? Well, because we've all learned to play the part, I look at my brothers, I look at other men and go, well, you're a real man and you're a real man. I must be the only one who feels I can't, live up to those expectations. So what do? Well, I engage in basically lifelong performance to play the part, to be the man. And so a lot of the behavior we see among men in the workplace, in the locker room, is theater. It's not an authentic discourse among men. It's theater to prove that you are one of the boys, to prove that you are a real man. And that need to prove it becomes a really sort of cogent and potent part of our political establishment. Do you remember, a number of you remember years ago and men acting out on that basis. Some of you remember the build-up to the first Gulf War in 1990, was it? So some of you remember that George Bush Sr. was way down in the polls. The word on him was he was a wimp. Do you remember this? And do you remember how quickly that war started and the images that George Bush used to start the war? I'm going to draw a line in the sand. It was schoolyard stuff, and challenge Saddam to step across it. And so, this quick war, U.S. wins, his poll ratings go way up for a while. So using that insecurity, and it is amazing. If you think the guy, and there might be other examples of other presidents we could imagine, I don't know who they might be, but have this unbelievable insecurity about their masculine credentials. And this is scary stuff. When if I say that all men, no man can live up to these expectations, well, that's bad enough. But if you give some of those men, who have that fear of not being manly enough, you give them nuclear weapons, that becomes really damn scary. And so the implications of this are not just around, how I relate to you, or how I relate to you, or how I behave, but how men construct societies of men's power. How these gender politics, gender ideals, gender insecurities get articulated at the level of national and international discourse and policy, and how they filter through our society as a whole. So my book talks about these themes. It's a popular book. It tells a lot of stories. Attempts at humor here and there. And there's some specific areas of focus. There's a case in it that says to men, here's why you should be part of the gender equality revolution. There's that. It talks about listening. It talks about this paradox of men's power. And then there's three heavy, not heavy, but just weighty, long chapters on three topics. One is on ending gender-based violence, ending men's violence against women as a critical area of focus, and as we know, just part of so many people's lives, and it's something that all of us must be speaking out about and working to end, whether it's its impact in our communities or impact on the workplace, and beyond. So there's a whole bunch on ending violence against women. There's a big long chapter on fatherhood and transforming our relations in the home. If you want some good news in all this stuff, here's the good news. You and I are living through a total transformation in the role of fathers. When my kids were young, I'm 68, I've got grandchildren now. I was going to show you slides of my grandchildren, but they told me not to, but they're fantastic. But anyway, I know, I was right. But when I was, when my kids were young, and I'd say to someone, I can't do something tonight, they say, you're babysitting tonight. Or it's great how much you help out with your kids. If anyone said that to my son, you help out with your kids, he would kill them, in a nice way, of course, but you know what I mean. If you talk to young men now, young men don't say, I help out with the kids or I babysit. They say, I'm a parent. And what we're seeing now among younger fathers is a dedication, and it's happening because of feminism, because of women, because of women's entry into the paid workforce that was really taking off in the 60s, and not just the entry into it, but the staying in and advancing in the workforce. And that pressure for women has led to this incredible transformation in men's lives. It's an area we may talk about. It's an area that Promundo does some incredible work around. And so this is good news, and we're seeing this around the world. In some countries, we have good policies to support that. Parental leave policies. Canada, where I live, is about to increase the parental leave from 40 to 45 weeks of paid leave. They increased there specifically to introduce what are called daddy days. Some of you have heard of the Nordic model around this, where it's a bit of social engineering that says we're going to have a certain number of weeks of parental leave that can only be used by a father or a second female parent, and if you don't use it, you lose it. And what's incredible is the impact of that. So in the province of Quebec, where they've had this for about 10 years, when they introduced it, the participation of men in parental leave went from about 20% to 85%, almost like within a year. It's just instant. But one of the important things is the lifelong impact. And so studies from the Scandinavian countries show that 20 years, 30 years, 20 years, after the introduction of daddy days, about that. It's still, those men in that cohort are still doing an equal amount of housework. Even dads who didn't take father's leave. It's literally changed the social norm in that society. So yes, there are incredible policies in all these areas, ending violence against women, the transformation of fatherhood, and the third big area discussed in the book, the transformation of our workplaces. So all the key issues, whether it's around ending sexual harassment, developing work-life balance, the critical issue of equal pay, the issues of women's advancement, and all these issues, they're both personal issues, how we individually are part of these struggles, part of these changes, how we embrace them in our lives, what it means. This, change, again, is difficult. A male-female couple trying to figure out how to split the housework, that's not a pretty picture. You've got to do an audit. You've got to figure out who does what. You've got to be in a good mood to do that. So, this is difficult stuff. But it's not just at that individual level, but it's at the level of policy. It's at the level of policy, government policy, corporate policy, the types of programs we bring, the types of laws we advance. And so, there's so many debates. I know many of you are part of these days when we think of issues around women's advancement, issues around, should there be quotas? And there's sort of new life to that debate in recent years. Once we figured out, the various researchers figured out, extrapolating from the piecemeal change now, I can't remember the number, but in England it's like there will be gender equity in management of women in 2078 or some crazy number like that. It's like, oh, that's nice. So most of us don't want to wait that long. So a lot of discussion on do we need quotas and so on. So all these things are about individual commitment. They're about making sure the organizations we work for, whether it's an NGO, whether it's a government agency, whether it's a private corporation or co-op, whatever it might be, are figuring out how they can embrace change. And there's just some amazing examples of that. I don't see, is Judy from Rio Tinto here? I was going to give them a shout out. But in so many different companies, we're seeing not just window dressing to look good, but genuine effort. And there's genuine effort because there are feminists everywhere, and there are men supporting gender equality everywhere. And so these changes are happening, but we can't be complacent. We have to push for it. We have to fight for it. We have to talk about it. We have to advocate it. We have to figure out how to get men's voices out there as part of the gender equality revolution. And that has its own challenges. It's not, Gary and I and others, joke about what that could look like. Are men stepping in and saying to women, okay, sisters, you did a great job until now, but we'll look after things. That's sort of men's behavior. Are we going to sort of take over again? What does it mean for men to be allies in this fight? What does it mean? What does it look like? What are the challenges? What are the difficulties? And partly what our answer to all that is, we just need to talk about these things. We just need to be honest that this is hard stuff. We're changing our lives, and we're changing the world. That's what we're doing. We're changing the world. And we're changing our brains. So of course it's going to be difficult. And so I think we have to approach it with as much openness, compassion, love. One of the things that we need to do is, in particularly, when I think of how polarized things are there, how do we reach those people we're not talking to? How do we get across that divide? We can't just be speaking to 50% of the population. So what does it mean to be reaching across those divisions and divides, to find language, to find policies, to find programs that can actually engage people who are not on side, we could say. These are big challenges. So some of those things we can probably talk about in the discussion. But I want to leave with this one final message, which is a line from the book. The book is an appeal to men. It is an appeal, unabashed appeal to men to join the gender equality revolution. It includes, I hope, some tools to do that, an argument to do it, some how-tos to do it. But it also says this: what you and I, what the women's movement has been doing, and those of us men who have been in support have been doing, this is something our generations are going to be talked about by our great-great-great-great-grandchildren. They're going to look back at this moment of human history, and they're going to say, that's when it changed. That's when it happened. You and I are living the gender equality revolution. So let's make it happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. I'm going to invite Gary Barker to come sit up, stand up, for your rights, which we'd like to do. I think we should all probably sit down for
Probably sit
the.
in the middle, so we don't.
You should sit in the middle and.
All right.
And
I met Barb Marley, you know.
did you meet
I
Bob Marley?
did.
That is an important
It
reality.
was an amazing moment, if I could just interrupt. There were all these short, I was doing, my PhD research was on Jamaica. And on my first trip there in 1980 or something, there were all these shortages. And so this colleague from York University where I was teaching said, listen, all these shortages. And she was doing research on Rastafarians. And she said, you got to bring Bob some rice and cooking oil. And I said, Bob, yeah, Bob, you know. So anyway, so there I was, this bright-eyed grad student with my big bag of rice and a jug of cooking oil, checking into Tough Gong Studios, and there's Bob Marley and the Wailers outside, of course, stoned out of their minds, playing football and getting to chat about my PhD research with Bob Marley. Did you know that?
Well,
No,
you know
I
what? To bring it back to our subject,
Yes, thank you very much.
No, this is Rob. One of my favorite artists is Bob Marley. I spent a night in Lagos, Nigeria, with Femi Kuti, who's Fela Kuti's son, if I get the names right. Sometimes I mess them up. And one of the work that he does is homeless boys can come spend the night and go for free to his concert. He performs every night from like 9 to 2 with a big African dance performance and so forth. But young men can come stay there and get fed, but they also get a lesson in safe sex and a lesson in HIV, AIDS, and SIDA. So, see, these artists are making a huge difference in all of our lives. But I want to, before we jump into some of the what and why and how men can show up, I want to come to kind of the first part. The time has come, and I want to, ask both of you, why now? Is it just the numbers, right? If you sit where I sit, you say 1992 was the year of the woman in Congress, except that now we're 131, so the numbers are higher. You talked a little bit about men are talking about this now in a way that 10 or 15 years ago they weren't. Some policies have changed. We were talking before stage, the sort of Swedish latte dad thing. That was probably about 10 years ago, but the time has come. What is this moment in history, or what's the confluence? And Gary, I know you might have some thoughts on that. Why now?
I mean, we can be excited about the progress, but I also want to hold up just how far we have to come. The 200 years that World Economic Forum estimates that we'll achieve gender equality is appalling. So we can look at the half full, which is women's voices and the advances, but 200 years is pretty much a glass half empty. So I think the why now is to look at how big that number is and say what we have to do. I think it's also important so we as Promundo have been doing this for 20 years. There's a global network called Men Engage that's now about 700 NGOs strong. And I think we need to be really modest about what that means. That is a pittance of global activism. You don't get men if you say, hey, men, you want to talk about giving up power and privilege, let's do a march tomorrow. It is a really lonely, we've tried it, and it's a lonely march. So I do think it's important to acknowledge we're freaks of men who do this. Mm-hmm. That is not to celebrate what we're doing, and I think that's an important piece not to, but it is to acknowledge that the why now means saying we've got to acknowledge what an uphill battle this is. We've got a lot of men to convince. This is in your self-interest to change, and I think that's a piece that we shied away from, to say the same ideas about manhood, and Michael talked about this in terms of the contradictions of power, these same ideas about manhood, and you don't need a mansplainer to tell women what patriarchy means in your lives as women, but we do need some mansplaining to men of, we die 5 years earlier on average because of the ways we treat our body, masculine norms. We're doing a cost calculation. I won't give away the number, but the numbers become billions when you look at the cost in public health of living while male. That is, of drinking, driving, causing harm to others, taking harm upon your own body. It comes into billions. You'll have that number in about a month and a half. That we also have to appeal to men's self-interest. We die because of these ideas about the man box. That's the leading cause of death for men. And if the Surgeon General sometime becomes honest, there will be a label, warning toxic masculinity is bad for our health. So I think I think part of is to say the time is we need to also hold this up for men. The other piece that I think the time is we've got a lot of amazing, any social scientists in the room? Yay! All right. That's not very many though, come on. We've spent a lot of time figuring out what moves human behavior. One, self-interest helps, but we've also figured out a lot of times of what it takes to change the environment around people to try to drive the change. So what we call social norms or the lived environment, all that stuff. And so part of what Michael and Promundo and lots of us do is how to get individual men to change. But I think the big question to us is how do we change the world around men so that we don't give men a lot of choice? In terms of the world we all expect you to live equality. So let's take the largest global poverty alleviation activity in the world, cash transfer programs, sometimes called social protection. Reach millions. We've just done a review of 100 of them and the data that's there. 3 of those actually include any activities that try to engage men to be supportive partners and to be more involved in hands-on care work. So the biggest poverty alleviation buckets of programming in the world don't even ask men to do anything extra at home or to support their female partner. Now those 3 that did, men changed their attitudes and behaviors. So we know that if you change the expectation, there's a lot more evidence there. But I think what I'm pushing you on that one is to say, maybe worry less about some of the individual man change and to think about how we change the structure around men. Vocational training program, since you segued to Jamaica, and then we'll hand it back to you. Trinidad, a vocational training program I visited a few years back, you get your certificate by the government to go through Serval. I don't know if you've been there, if you and Bob went to, no?
You didn't
Okay.
Bob?
Everybody who went through it, and it was about 2/3 young men, often had been in trouble with the law, you know what that typically means. No questions asked. To get your certificate, you had to spend some volunteer hours in the daycare center caring for young children. Making boys care for young babies with some training, of course. A little bit of training could be useful, so not to put the children at risk. So examples like that let us change the world around men to say the space that we're drawing for you and making for you makes you act in ways that require equality. Whether it's a prenatal visit that nudges men toward getting a checkup afterwards, whether it's obligatory comprehensive sexuality education that includes gender messaging. Try that in some of the red states, for example. Ask me about our CDC funding cutoff afterwards in terms of a government that doesn't support that. But we know if you do it well and you include the gender messages, we can nudge men toward the change. So if to me the time is now, we've also got, yay to the social scientists here, we've been figuring out a lot of what gets people to change. Let us be brave enough to then roll that out, not just to rely on a few of us giving good talks, which is really important, and saying this message, but also to change that environment around men. Yeah.
Let me expand on something. And Michael, one of the topics in your book is the violence against women. And one of the things that's driving, I would say, media and some of these discussions is this Me Too movement. What has that done in being able to accelerate some of the work that Gary's talking about, or the ability to be able to come up and sort of join the party? Is the positives and negatives of that? We can come later to how men can show up for the movement. But what's the impact of the sort of Me Too movement on this dialogue and this conversation?
One of the amazing things it's done is the way it's ended the silence. One of the original slogan of the White Ribbon Campaign, which a few of us started in 1991, a campaign for men to speak out against violence against women, was end men's silence to end men's violence. And one of the things that's happened with Me Too is because it's been so public and high profile, it's meant that within families, or in relationships, around dinner tables, at workplaces, there's just been endless conversations. And some of it started off, with and I've heard this from so many people, start off with maybe, man, ranting a bit about this, and his wife, his daughter, his workmate saying, I never told you, but it happened to me. And so I think that there's just been an explosion, and just this outpouring has been, it's such a powerful moment. It's one of the things that I use this I say this in the book, I use this line, but I say that when men listen to women's voices, it's like reading this precious diary that we didn't even know existed. And so I think part of it is that. On the other hand, I think there's a lot of men who are scared and are confused at this moment. There's a lot of men who are replaying their biographies in their head and saying, okay, did that cross a line? Was I just, was it this, was it that? And so I think I think a lot of men are feeling worried, feeling fear, and it's in some ways it's a very healthy concern because it's sort of rethinking things that were just the norm. We have the term now rape culture. In writing this book, I realized the first time I was exposed to rape culture, it was in grade 6. It was, or grade 7, somewhere in there, but outside Carr Junior High in Durham, North Carolina, where I lived. And some boy was telling the other guys about the difference between raping and fucking. And he said, raping is when you tie the girl to a tree. And it's like, and it was, this sort of using language that we absolutely didn't hear at the time. And it was like, that was where it was beginning. It was just like this making a joke out of it. And that's how young it starts. Well, so suddenly we're hearing about this stuff. We're having discussions about it. And that's a really positive thing. But it is a difficult moment. And I think we have to find ways to, there's a process, I think, of any movement and whether there are ways to promote not, both the calling out men on abuses of power, but also figuring out forms of healing and going forward. I don't even know what that looks like, but...
Like truth and reconciliation after conflict sort of thing, which becomes... And I wonder, and you opened up the spaces too, is in your opening remarks, how do men join this movement? I mean, how do you, not just Me Too, but, I use the example, so where were the men dressed in white last night, and would that have been appropriate? How are they going to show up to the movement? It's nice that it's opening up the dinner table, maybe in some of the private spaces. We know it's opening up in the media. But when are men going to show up to the movement, or how, and how can they do that? It
has to be more than just marching us with a Gillette razor in hand, I guess.
Yeah. No, just Gillette razor, or the rows are walking and going the one day of wearing, or the one day of wearing white, right? But how can men show up to this movement?
Why don't I start and then jump in? To think about it both at the individual level and the organizational level, I think is really important. So part of it is just by this ongoing conscious act of listening, asking questions of the women in our lives. And doesn't mean that the answer we get is four corners of the truth or something, but it's part of the truth, and it's just to listen to. So just I think talking with men about listening with respect, listening and learning. And it's the same thing of if I want to understand as a white person the realities of racism, I'm going to ask a person of color. If I want to understand the realities of homophobia and heterosexism, I'm going to ask ask and listen to an LGBTQ person. So I think that part of it's that individual listening. Part of it is encouraging action. So it's not just about listening, but it's about saying, okay, how can we in our homes reshape our domestic lives in ways that will be not more equal, that will be equal. And that's hard work, but it means that conscious attitude, it means understanding to really think about and challenge the ways that we're raising our girls and boys. The messages that we give girls and boys. It's usually unconscious, but it's just we're pulverizing them with both literal and figurative blues and pinks all the time. And so to both question that and then challenge ourselves and each other. But it also means institutional responses. So it means within our workplaces, being advocates for change. One of the things I've been asked to do a lot more in the last couple of years than any time before was speaking to corporate audiences. And one of the things I stress to men in those things is the importance of making a pledge to be a workplace leader for gender equality and women's rights. Mm-hmm. And not as an add-on to your job, but as a central part of your job. And to see what that means. And as soon as we begin to see what it means, then just this whole world opens up. Canada, I'm going to turn to you on policy in 1 second, but Canada has started it's just beginning, but has decided that every government department has to use gender-based analysis, or GBA+, on all of its policies. Now, not all of them are instantly doing it, but I think 1/3 have done it so far. Well, that is key, because then suddenly you're looking at the world in a different way, and it's going to bring different results. Could you continue on sort of policy stuff a bit more? Or?
Yeah, and I was thinking a little bit of, so what is it that we want male allies to do? I mean, one, I think it's important to acknowledge how it's risky in a lot of different settings for men to stand out on this. The backlash, whether, the Gillette ad just that you brought up, there was 1 million dislikes compared to about 500,000 likes. Now, part of those million are probably bots, and we know where those are generated. And I don't mean out of the White House, I meant out of Russia. But we know that there's a lot of anger to question manhood, and even the use of the term toxic masculinity, the number of men who kind of get defensive about it. We're doing a survey that we'll launch March 8th together with Bonobos, and just some of the first data found that about half of women and about half of men, when asked, said that men get criticized if they speak out for women's equality. So both men and women acknowledge that men who stand up for this often take heat. And then the other extreme is that a few men speak out on it and they get, we sort of get knighted for just saying what is obvious about gender equality. So I think there is this, how do we make the space safer in the middle for men to be doing the right thing? And I think part of it, you alluded to, is making it normal through policy. So whether it's workplace policy or public policy. One way that you can create safe spaces is try to convince a lot of men to go along with an idea. But what if we do something like, well, there's quotas in our workplace, and we have quotas in lots of other places. There's no negotiation about that. We're doing it. We believe in this equality. And let's make paternity leave obligatory. Mm-hmm. Let's do another piece of policy that says, not that you maybe want to take the days off, but we're going to make them obligatory days off to do the caregiving that's required. Then we change the world around men, and then the discourse becomes, well, this is the new normal here. So I think that doesn't do it all. Obviously, we've got to have the social change that goes with it. But I think, how is it that we acknowledge this is challenging stuff for a lot of men to speak out? A piece of work that we also did with ACTS, ask young men, they know a myriad of ways to act appropriately when they see somebody else being harassed or bullied. They want to act appropriately when they see somebody else harassed or bullied, a male or female. 89% said they didn't do anything because they're afraid the violence will come toward them. So whether it's speaking out for leadership or speaking out when you see actual harm being done, that is still scary for a lot of men, and a lot of young men and a lot of adult men. So I think it pushes, I think Michael's in joining us to say we need a lot of listening about it, and we need a lot of how do we change the space around men so that this becomes normal. So it's not, the kind of, it's got to be heroic to do it, or it's just got to be, it's normal. I think that's the space we want to move into.
That's what you do.
Yeah. And one final bit is the development of campaigns, so actual activities.
Yeah.
So when we started the White Ribbon campaign in 1991, just 3 of us sitting around our living rooms and kitchens, and with this idea that men should be speaking out. And within a few months in Canada, probably 100,000 men were wearing a white ribbon, speaking out against violence against women. And that was because of the impact of women on men's lives. It was also about a national tragedy that we had happened when 14 women had been murdered in Montreal 2 years before. But partly to our surprise, that this white ribbon thing has spread around the world to, I think, about 90 countries. Some of these have come and gone, some are really tiny campaigns, but there are a few of them are really big national efforts where you have they're just almost like a national holiday. And so I think these types of campaigns, Gary helped start a wonderful effort called Men Care, which both learned from what we did right with men with White Ribbon and the mistakes we made to develop a campaign where focused on, with the goal of men doing half of the care work on the planet. So that involves the mobilization of men and women to both develop policy, do research, have fatherhood classes, do public campaigning. So I think, the other thing is just activism is key.
So before I turn it over to the audience for questions, I want to sort of ask, Michael, you've alluded to a couple of times the sort of policy thing. So we've talked a little bit about paternity leave or family leave. We've talked a little bit about caregiving. We've alluded to quotas. What are some of the other policies? I mean, what are some of these other, I think caregiving is a very large part of that. That's going to change both the norms in both the public and private space, right? But what are some of the other policies that we're thinking about that can be really interesting in helping change change the space around men and allow men to sort of join the movement with women.
I'll give you one that I referred to earlier when I referred to Rio Tinto, and it's a piece of work that Gary and I are doing together. Rio Tinto, this international mining giant, I just want to see if Judy came in here, so I'm, okay. Just so I don't say anything. She's going, no, that's not right. So I can make anything up now, basically. No, but this is amazing. Rio Tinto was part of a program in Australia called the Workplace Accreditation Program, which is a program sort of like, ISO 2000 on workplace safety. So this companies, public sector organizations, the whole Australian Army went through, and it's basically a 1 or 2 year process that involves a company doing research internally, looking at policies, doing public outreach to women's organizations and communities, doing training to develop policies around everything from sexual harassment at work to the impact of domestic violence on the workplace. So Rio Tinto was part of it. They got their accreditation. And as part of that, they said, we're going to bring in a remarkable policy of 7 days paid leave to any employee experiencing domestic violence. So now the North American parts of Rio Tinto have said, well, oh yeah, we're going to do even better. So they've actually just in December instituted a policy of 10 days paid leave to any person in Rio Tinto who is experiencing domestic violence. It doesn't have to be all at once. It doesn't go on their employment records. It could be for a family member. So if you're called and your daughter needs help and you've got to go, you get paid leave for that. You get emergency housing support. And as significant, and this goes to Gary's point of changing the whole environment, partly just that changes the environment. That provides the type of safety and support that women need to leave abusive relationship, or in a few cases, men perhaps. But it goes beyond that, because to bring in a policy, and this is the work we've been doing, is it takes a lot of internal training. And so now they're going through an ambitious internal training program where managers and supervisors are doing a full day of training, which is a lot, that looks at the causes of violence against women, what it looks like, how to spot the warning signs, and how you can act effectively to end the isolation of a woman experiencing the violence. And so what that's doing is it's also sending out a very clear message to the 80% of their staff who are men, that how this company thinks about the acceptability of violence against women. It's a safety program. It's an ambitious program. It's absolutely inspiring. And that's just one company, because a few people in that company said, we should be doing something. That's all it took. A few people said, we've got to do something, and they fought for it, and they were part of a program that allowed it to happen. And now that's spreading in their operations around the world.
Maybe jump in with 3 policy pieces there. One is public health. Across the way, USAID, lots of colleagues from AID here, we have been a global funder of some of the most important public health work globally. We've not looked enough at what that looks like to say we need men to be full partners in that. For maternal and child health is a pretty blank space around engaging men and boys, a few examples of that. We know some things that work to bring men to be partners in maternal and child health, but also to look at men's own health. We've advised Brazil's Ministry of Health for a number of years to create a men's health unit and figure out ways that get men in the door. We don't like to go for preventive care, but it actually is possible to get men to come in the door for preventive care. So I think one would say health. And also on health, we have also been the global funder on sexual and reproductive health, which has a poor track record for saying we think men can be full partners. Men are about 25% of contraceptive use at the moment, and they've been about 25% of contraceptive use since the mid-1980s. That doesn't look like a very good metric of success of trying to engage men, partly because we're not doing much to do so. We've spent a huge amount on building the systems for that. What would it take to nudge men to do more of that? The other ones that we've talked about certainly already are parental leave. Paid parental leave in the US, we guess it would cost about 0.5% of payroll taxes. And we've got the corporate sector saying that we can't afford that. And we know all the benefits of it. We are the shameful one global industrialized country that has 0 paid days. We're equitable because we don't give it to women or men. So we score high in equity. But we're pretty shameful when it comes to the global, and even in this city, which we've got great leave, well, decent leave, again, the corporate sector part, and it's a 0.65% of payroll that we have to do it. Gender-based violence, I'll add, is the last one. We've got a science of primary prevention. There's a growing science of what works. Whether it's group education, psychosocial support for children who have witnessed it, economic support for women together with prevention work, support services for survivors, combined with all those things, there's a growing science of what works. Again, a policy is fund what works and take it to scale. This country could fund VAWA, not to mention VAWA within the country. We know what this stuff works, so one policy is simply build on that amazing evidence base and get it out there.
Well, and the word combined and integrated is not lost in the sense of don't just do one thing for women over here and one thing for men over here, but this is an ecosystem that they're working in.
And also to think about, when we think about policies and men within that, I mean, you can't turn to any part of social life. I mean, I would say one thing in the U.S., you've got to dismantle the prison system because it disproportionately affects black men. And in Canada, it disproportionately affects Indigenous men. And so until so we've got to turn to every part of our social structures in life. Because again, we've got to understand in all these things, we can't treat men as this homogenous group. We have to understand this hierarchy of power among different groups of men, the intersection of different forms of oppression. And so the policy has to have that broad intersectional approach, and it's not just a slogan. The prison system is a great example that this isn't just an academic bit of verbiage. This is reality for so many people.
Absolutely. So I want to turn it over to the audience. We've got about 10 or 15 minutes for questions. We have microphones, and you do need to ask your question into the microphone for the live stream. And I ask you to please identify yourself quickly, and please make sure you ask a question. Use an inflection at the end, because we've got some great expertise and energy up here. And so we have a question, two people right up here in the front row, and then we'll come back to the middle.
Hi, my name is Gretchen Bloom. I used to work in Rome for the World Food Program, Michael, and you presented there the White Ribbon Campaign at IFAD, I think it was. So where now are you going to go in America? Who wants you to come and talk about this book and launch it? So anyway.
Gretchen, it's great to see you again. Well, I guess that's a question for others to answer. One of the things that we did with White Ribbon specifically was we decided from the start it should be a decentralized campaign because we really felt that people in their own communities knew best how to reach the men and the boys. That's part of the strength of White Ribbon. It's why it's spread around the world. It's also why it's like, there's no coordination, there's no central office, there's no one who can say, oh, well, we're going to, target the U.S. There are White Ribbon campaigns here and there on campuses. In Massachusetts, there's a campaign, but I'd love to see more. And so for those of you who do have contacts across the U.S., let them know.
Let the energy spread.
So you don't have it already programmed. She said this was the first of a launch.
Oh, yes.
And you're heading off. So who has invited you? Somebody must have invited you.
Yeah, well, some of them are... Someone has. We can talk about it. But different organizations. Part of that is just in the works. We're hoping that different organizations will say, let's do an event like this. And so it's in the works. But there are events now planned in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Boston, Chicago.
Antonio, I know it's just
I was going to say, Gary, you can name them, right?
There's a few things.
I think I heard of a few.
There's a few
of those.
things. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, I'm Megan Donahue. I'm a gender consultant. But my question is, how do we work with boys and girls, but not just boys and girls, their parents and the teachers, because they can be together in a group. I know, Gary, we talked about this. They can be in a camp or whatever, and then they return to another environment. So how do we make it a comprehensive kind of intervention? Okay.
I know one of the school programs I did a number of years ago, working with boys in grades 6 and 7, one of the components was actually a fatherhood group with that. So I met with the fathers of those boys several times. That was a beautiful example of that. But I think it's a really good point, getting the parents in. And one of the things we have to do if we want to get men in, we have to make that explicit. Our colleagues, some of our colleagues in England, that do a lot of work on fatherhood. They decided they were working with some schools that said we're trying to get parents, the male parents more involved. So, so this one school said, oh yeah, we want the fathers coming out. So their flyer for the next parent-teacher, meeting said, this is, because there's only women coming basically. So their flyer said, everyone is welcome, only the women came. So we have to name it. We have to name so the next flyer said, women and men welcome. And suddenly all the men were there. Because oh, we can come too? I didn't know that.
Yeah. It's the
Naming it.
title. It goes back to calling it the gender issue, right?
Yeah.
And we've in favelas in Rio said that didn't work, just inviting men either. So we did a barbecue and a soccer league
See, that's what I was
and
expecting.
T-shirts.
So sports.
12 goodies later, we're getting men in the door. But then, what it takes to make that normal, right? And then after that, they're kind of Saturday morning going, hey, where's that session?
And I think really making all this part of people's lives. People send me white ribbon pictures from around the world, and one of them that I love is this. It was a white ribbon wrestling tournament in some village in Pakistan, but just getting to the men. Another sent this picture of these ox carts taking farmers in Cambodia from village to village to talk about men's violence against women. In New Zealand, there's an effort by some ex-bikers, real bikers, who drive their Harleys from town to town, and they roar up in the town, and they talk again about ending violence against women. So I think part of our efforts have to be of saying to men, you know how to reach the men around you. Figure out ways to do it, and don't worry about just you know how to do it.
But I think that piece, before I go to the next question, about getting the father involved and really involved in the home environment, about those conversations with children and the practices with children, and not just the mom. The gentleman here in the middle, and then...
Thank you. My name's Bob Inholm, and I've begun to talk with Gwen about the centennial of women getting the right to vote, which is something a lot of people are thinking about. But as I sort of almost raised my hand when you asked who are social scientists, because I'm a historian, but I'm devoted to the principle that history affects how we deal with our current day. And so that provokes my question, which is, have you thought of historical analogs to what you're trying to do? Or always when you think about history, it's like dividing humanity by time. There are ways of dividing humanity by culture as well. So are there other cultural parallels to the kind of change that you're trying to initiate? And I would just offer women's suffrage in the United States and frankly around the world. Its time came at that time. It's not a mistake that in what we think of as Europe and the United States and North America or whatnot, women got the right to vote all within a couple of decades. It was the time, and people thought about it. And women didn't have the political power to take the right to vote. I know that they did the things that they could do, but my point is that at the end of the day, it required men to vote for this. And how did that happen, I think, is an interesting question and very parallel to what you're trying to do now. So I just wonder if you've thought about that. Thank you.
No, a good or yes, and the challenge of finding historical examples when we've gotten men to give up power and privilege. I think when I'm looking at my colleague Alexa, who's our communications coordinator, we have, and some of our research team tried to say there's got to be, this is a long field of not many success stories of getting men to change. So occasionally on those desperate Friday afternoons, you're kind of what would work. And I think so we end up looking at things like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in some countries of what do you do when there's been an amount of violence used by so many people that you cannot put the individual perpetrators in prison and hold them accountable that way. So what are other models of accountability? So the Gacaca courts in Rwanda, for example, of how do you help lots of other things you could say about the rebuilding in Rwanda, but processes that say this is not just a handful of men who have caused harm in the case of certain forms of violence. Gandhian approaches. How can we help the oppressor see the cost to his or her own soul for being the oppressor? And how can we hold up a mirror that says, I know there's a better you in there. What does it take for you to realize the cost to your own self by continuing to act out oppression and harm every day? So I think there are a few examples. We have coasters in our office of Gandhi and of Mandela, because we're trying to find a few examples of where there are, in fact, men trying to change a culture of masculinity that also involved holding up power and privilege. If you can help us identify 2 or 3 others, that would be great. But I do think it's on to something to say we do need some good models that look at have we achieved some kind of a cultural shift.
And I think, you know, along with sort of celebrating women's suffrage here, would be a nice little thing that talks about the men who supported that, because there was active organizing by men. There's a nice, if you're interested in that particularly, there's a compilation, it's a documentary collection of men who've supported women's rights over the past several hundred years, co-edited by Michael Kimmel and Tom Mossmiller. And I can't remember the name of it, but it's really interesting. And there are more men than you would expect. You know, the writings of Frederick Douglass, many others are just pretty incredible.
We will take one more question, I think right in front of you.
And I'll certainly be sticking around afterwards to chat. Yeah.
All right, thank you. My name is Mariana Prado. I'm a master's student at Georgetown University studying conflict resolution, and I do my research on gender. So when thinking about men, and especially men that live outside our nice progressive bubble of DC, men that aren't woke, when trying to engage with them, what is an effective way to frame the conversation about toxic masculinity and toxic masculine norms without generating a backlash, without them feeling attacked just by being men?
I mean, one of the things that I try to do, you know, sometimes when I'm speaking, you know, not an audience like this, but, you know, a public talk or whatever it might be, there'll be some men's rights types that get up and they'll just start ranting and raving, and they'll say, no, you've got it all wrong. Men are the ones who are suffering. Men, you know, some things that Gary was mentioning, and they'll reel off statistics and they'll say, you know, the pendulum has swung too far, you know, blah, blah, blah. And I actually find the points I can agree with them to start. I don't start by disagreeing with them. I say, you're absolutely right. Men do die younger. Men are more likely to be addicted to alcohol and other drugs. Men are more likely to be in prison. You're absolutely right. Like, and they're sort of, and in other words, I listen to them. So I'd say, if we want to speak to anyone, we've got to listen to them. We can't start by, you know, ranting at them. And so across any political divide, we've got to do listening, and it's hard. So I listen to him, and then I say, you know, we agree on the problem, but, you know, I think the reason is not because of feminism or women, but the ways that we have defined men's power and, you know, and so on. And so to find those points of connection, of commonality, I think is really important. I think to go back to this contradictory experience of men's power that I speak about is men live incredibly isolated lives. And this is like this bizarre truth. We've created, you know, fraternities, congresses, sports leagues of men being together. But what actually those things do is that they provide a framework so men feel safe. They actually aren't safe, but they feel safe within these structures of men's power. And men feel, I think all of us on some level live in real fear and terror. There's true isolation in the lives of men. Now, this does not mean that men are the biggest victims of patriarchy, but it means in that paradoxical way, men pay a price for the ways we've constructed the societies of men's power. And so what it means is, and I think a lot of the work that Gary and I do and that Promundo does, is we reach out to men with compassion. Compassion doesn't mean you give excuses for violence or abuse, but it is about reaching out to human beings and understanding the humanity in other people. So I think the more that we can, across all of our different divides, try to do some listening, try to reach out with compassion, but not back down from disagreements, you know, I think that can help. Gary?
You know, if you're watching a movie in another language, it'll have subtitles at the bottom, right? So most men, so even just one clear example here, most men, when you say toxic masculinity, they read at the bottom, all men are bad. So I think one very simple thing we've got to work on is how to have a conversation that calls men into this. So we've been using the conversation about the man box or finding common ground that said these set of ideas about manhood cause us all harm, and trying to create a safe space where we're allowed to talk about it. Margaret Atwood has a wonderful quote where she says, "What are women afraid of about?" Well, yeah, that men are afraid of women laughing at us, and women are afraid of men killing them. So that is a wonderful conversation starter to get men to say, what do you think she meant by that? And then sometimes I'll take it a step further and say, what if I told you that I'm also afraid of a man killing me? Are men allowed to talk about this? What are the things that men are also afraid of? And could we find some common ground about The other thing we know from our research is that you don't get through boyhood without experiencing some violence from another man or boy. I don't know where that boy who lived through that boyhood is, but 90x% of us have experienced some form of violence from a man or a boy. And I think acknowledging, again, that doesn't decenter the conversation, but that we acknowledge that's there, and can we find a common cause there? And then to say, I assume, not that you're trying to be a bringer of harm, to cause harm to others, but that I assume there's a full beating human heart inside who wants to get out. And then I'm not trying to fix you, I'm trying to let you be who you want to be. So I think we also flip the dynamic a bit to say, I'm trying to create the space that allows you to be your better self, not I'm here trying to fix you. And that's the other piece that men read when they see our stuff. They read across the bottom, Pramunda wants to fix you and make you a different kind of man, as opposed to saying we want to help you be the better person you can be. I know those sound obvious and they take a lot of time and questioning and all that stuff, but it's not easy because we know that 2/3 of those men who might be in your group or in that session have caused some kind of real harm in the lives of women and girls, or someone who's gay, or fill in the blank. So it's how to find that delicate balance of calling some men out a lot of the time, but calling all men in for this bigger conversation.
Before Gwen closes, I want to just personally thank all of you for coming out. As you heard, this is the first of a number of launch events, so it just makes me feel really, really good. Writing books is a funny thing because you do all this stuff and then it sort of disappears for a while into the publisher's hands, and then finally it's there. So I really appreciate that so many of you did come today. And there's a bookseller out there with apparently just a few copies of the book. I don't want to start a stampede because I know that, but I do want to say that I know the book is.
And you will sign those that buy the books, right?
Although it will bring down the trade-in value if I sign it, but I will do that. But since there may not be enough, it is available at Politics and Prose and Kramer Books and other books here. Apparently, there's also some online booksellers I've heard about that might have it, but do support your local bookstores. But please, let others know. I would appreciate it.
Well, and just in closing, thank you, Michael. We'll be out there signing the book, and I think this is a timely conversation. I mean, this has been great, and the notion that it's joining the revolution now that we're in a period of history, which I think is incredibly fascinating, and that we're talking not just about sort of changing the men, but as we've talked about the environment around men, the space around men, the framework in which both men and women, frankly, have to operate. Because we didn't even talk about me stepping to the side to say, join me in the movement, right, or stand behind me, right? How can we join this together? Because all of these norms are changing, and we're all changing together. So we thank you today. I encourage you to stay and speak with all of us and buy those copies of the book.
And thanks to the Women in Public Service Project and to Gwen and the Wilson
thank you.
Center for their work.
No problem. Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you.